I mentioned at the beginning that Luke's gospel, or the writer of Luke's gospel, has the narrative of Mark before him. So Luke is following the narrative of Mark. If we remember that Mark's gospel is written, some scholars suggest, as early as 67 AD, so about 30 years after the time of Jesus, before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. And then Luke's gospel is written somewhere about 75 AD. So there's almost 10 years separating Mark from Luke, but with that intervening calamity that befell the Jewish community with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. It's important to remember that, I won't say a dialogue per se, but remember that the followers of Jesus are trying to remain faithful to the vision of Jesus regarding the reign of God, and trying to form a community around that vision that would best exemplify the values and the principles that Jesus laid out as he preached and taught and did his ministry in Galilee. The principles such as the great command, love God with your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That principle was to be the foundation upon which the community would build its life, among many others. It's clear by Jesus' ministry that it was to be an outreach to the poor, the blind, the lame, those who were, quote, enslaved in whatever way, oppressed in any way. Luke begins his gospel with a quote from Isaiah that the poor will have good news proclaimed to them, the blind will see, the lame will walk, prisoners will be set free, that it is a time of jubilee, the jubilee of God, where oppression will come to an end and freedom and liberation will happen. That was the vision that the early followers of Jesus held on to, but the challenge was that they lived in the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was not always friendly or appreciative or very welcoming of such a vision. In fact, the Roman Empire based its whole operation on its ability to oppress and enslave the people that they conquered and the people that they dominated. So that if you were a freeborn Roman citizen, you had privilege. If you were a slave, you had nothing. In fact, you had no name, you had no identity, except that which was given to you by your master. So that was the challenge. How do the followers of Jesus hold on to that vision of Jesus when you live in an empire that doesn't have the same vision, doesn't share the same values, doesn't share the same principles, and in fact is in many ways extremely hostile to you? Certainly by the time that Luke's gospel is written, there are already sporadic persecutions around the empire, including that which was initiated by Nero. Remember, the burning of Rome was attributed to the Christians. So there were frequent instances in which Christians, along with Jews, would be rounded up and, in a sense, put to death. So Christians who are trying to hold on to that vision of Jesus, living within an empire that is doing everything it can to not just persecute you, but to end your presence in their midst. And this was the context for these Gospels to be written. So that if we consider how this story is told in Mark, and then see it in Luke, what we see is, well, let me put it, remember the story again. The story says Jesus crosses the lake. Well, what you have to know about the geography of the area at the time of Jesus is that on one side of the Lake of Galilee was considered to be Jewish territory. And when you cross the lake to the other side of the territory, it was considered, the other side of the lake, it was considered Gentile territory. That's why in some, the Gerasenes, or the area of the Decapolis, which would be the indication that it was primarily Gentile, meaning the proliferation of gods and goddesses and the whole Roman ethos being. Conformity to that Roman ethos was what was on the other side of the lake. So it's surprising that when Mark tells the story of Jesus in the boat on the lake, calming the storm, which is the story right before this one, he gets off the boat in Gentile territory. Now, some scholars suggest that most likely Jesus would not have done this. So what Mark is trying to suggest to his community is that this mix of Jews and Gentiles in the community, you see Jesus is speaking to you too. So you are more than welcome in our community. Gentiles, you don't have to become Jewish to become a member of the community. You just simply have to accept and be open and embrace the way of Jesus, the vision of Jesus. So there's a contrast between what we're going to see in the next couple of weeks, what happens on one side on Jewish territory, and then what happens on the other. So when Mark and Luke had Jesus move into Gentile territory, you might imagine, and here's one of those creative and imaginative ways to consider this, that what's happening is you could see the whole movement of Jesus to directly confront that whole ethos of the empire that exists on the other side of the lake. And we don't have to go very far to see the effects of what empire does. This poor guy is judged to be possessed by demons and is forced into shackles and basically kept in a prison. And when he would break out, his only refuge was to go into the midst of the cemetery, because even the Romans were smart enough to know that you didn't associate with dead people. And so here this poor man, enslaved, shackled, degraded to the point where he doesn't even have clothes to wear, ends up in the middle of an unclean, dirty cemetery. So not only would Gentiles not go there, but certainly Jews wouldn't go there. And here Jesus enters into that space, and notice the man yells, the demons in the man recognize Jesus, know Jesus, because the empire always knows its enemies pretty well. They have the list, right? They have the list. All the names of the enemies of the empire on the list. Some of you may remember the 1950s and the whole McCarthy attacks on communism and so forth, right? You have the list, you know who they are. So the list is, but Jesus enters into that world, and the demons say, we know who you are, Jesus. In other words, we know what you are doing in your efforts to destroy the empire so that your kingdom, so to speak, will be established. And empires have a way of resisting any alternative narratives, any alternative visions of the way life should be. Don't have to look very far right now, right, in the Ukraine. That's, by the way, why the sunflowers are out in front of the altar today. You don't have to look very far, right? We try to reestablish an empire, stamping out democracy and the development and freedom of democracy. Well, it's not too far-fetched to imagine that Mark and Luke are using this event to highlight the power struggle, if you will, between the reign of God and the empire of Rome. In fact, if you notice that when Jesus says, "What's your name?" the response is Legion. So if you're in the audience of Mark or in the audience of Luke, and you hear that word, what are you going to think of? The very armies that are occupying your city, and the very armies that are brutalizing your women and killing your children and destroying your home, you're going to think immediately of that because the word is a buzzword. Maybe it doesn't mean anything to us, and we think of Satan and the demons, but to Jesus, to the audience of Mark and Luke, that's what they're hearing. And Jesus, in saying, okay, I know who my enemy is, and it's interesting. Notice how the demons say, oh, look over there, there's a herd of pigs. Why don't you send us into the pigs, and that'll take care of things, so that the demons will leave the man and go into the pigs. Now, imagine if you're a Jew in the audience of Mark and Luke, what you're going to think of that, right? That this is not kosher at all. And so for legion, empire, to be named demon, you see that's what's happening, right? That the correspondence between legion and demon is suggesting through Mark and Luke that you need to know that this empire that you're living in doesn't care about your freedom, your dignity, your integrity. Instead, this empire you're living in is quick to shackle you and to oppress you and leave you in the tombs to die. And so when Jesus commands them, like a Roman general might do, into the pigs, and notice the pigs run down the hill and drown in the lake. Now, little sideline, if you're the owner of those pigs and you're in the business of butchering pigs for food in the Gentile territory, you're not going to be happy with this story at all. Right? You're just not. There goes my whole year's herd of swine. But here's another way to consider it. Have you ever heard another story in the Bible that describes a legion, an army, running down into the water to drown? What is it? Moses and the armies of Pharaoh. There they are. The Israelites pass through the sea unhindered, only to find that the armies and the chariots and the charioteers of Pharaoh rush down into the waters and are drowned. And Israel has its freedom. Isn't it interesting? The final part of this story is notice what the people observe after this. The man, notice three things. He's in possession of himself, meaning he now has full dignity, and he's clothed, and here's the kicker, he's sitting at the feet of Jesus. And when you sit at the feet of Jesus, it indicates that you're now a full disciple of Jesus. Perhaps the resistance to the empire is the connection that one has to make for the community of Mark and for Luke and maybe for us, that if you allow the empire to shackle you and oppress you and rob you of your dignity, if you allow that to happen, then it's as much as death. It's like death. You have no future, you have no identity, you have little or no hope. But the vision of the reign of God enters into resistance with that empire and works for your liberation and freedom. It shouldn't surprise us that on June 19th, in celebration of Juneteenth, that this reading gets read. And I say that because you see, if you consider the whole history of the establishment of slavery in the United States, you know that the whole structure and institution, and by the way, this is sort of what critical race theory is trying to suggest. The whole history is that the economics of empire see people as property that are bought, sold, and used for the benefit of the economics of the institution or structure of empire. It's there in history. Just read it. So that as the story unfolds over the centuries, 2 centuries at least, that the struggle of the slaves against the empire at times seemed hopeless. They were powerless. And along come people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and many others who know this story and know the story of Exodus and know that God is not one who authorizes empire to enslave, shackle, and demean and degrade people. They know the story of Exodus, and they know this story that neither God nor Jesus intend for anyone to be slaves to another, to be pieces of property to be bought and sold. They know the story that God will always, always seek to liberate, to set free, and to make whole what was broken. They know that story well. They sing it in the spirituals and the Psalms over and over. That's what There Is a Balm in Gilead says. You know what? God intends for your healing. And here's how it's going to happen. And there will be a resistance to the hate and the oppression and the enslavement of empire. It will be, whether it's mental resistance, whether it's spiritual resistance or physical resistance, it will happen. Freedom will come. Liberation will happen. Harriet Tubman knew that every time she risked her life to take slaves out from the plantation. Frederick Douglass, from his other side perspective, knew what that was like because he had come from slavery. It must have seemed amazing that day when the proclamation was read in Galveston by the Union General to say, you know what? You thought you were always, always going to be slaves. Guess what? You're not. You're not. You have dignity. You have value. You have worth. You are a human being. You always have been. But the empire told a different story about you. Believing that story would have kept slavery. Seeing the other narrative of liberation and freedom set you on a course that sadly in many instances still is unfulfilled for some African Americans. I tie this together with the sense of how as people that we come first and foremost to understand that God never authorizes empires to enslave, oppress, degrade, or demean any human being. Whether their skin is black or brown or whatever ethnicity and race a person comes from, God will never authorize enslavement and oppression for people anywhere, everywhere, of any color. God will not do that. Secondly, if the empire at whatever time seems stronger and more powerful, then God sends people like Moses, like Jesus, like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and many, many others over time, and Martin Luther King Jr. and many, many others, to speak the narrative of God that says God intends for the dignity and the freedom of every person. God sends prophets such as them into the world to speak and tell a different narrative. And if you remember how the story ends today, when the man wants to follow Jesus, what does Jesus tell him? In Mark's gospel, it says it this way: go out, tell others what God in God's mercy has done for you, how the compassion of God has worked in your life to the point of your freedom and the restoration of your dignity, or the recognition of your dignity. Go and tell what God has done for you. How being free and being liberated from the shackles and the chains and the prison of oppression and slavery is not the vision of God, but rather your freedom, your dignity, your humanity is the vision of God. On June 19th, and even on this Father's Day, to recognize that God is always a God of liberation and freedom, and that God intends for us to share in that work of liberating and setting free and making whole the world around